as Obama entered the presidency in January of '09, what items were at the top of the Latin America agenda, and can you talk to me a little bit about how things seemed to be going early on? In April he went to the summit.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, there was, let me say, the Obama administration entered. He had made one speech on Latin America. It was certainly not a major issue in the campaign, Latin America. The one issue related to Latin America that got some attention was the trade issue, where Obama seemed to want to begin to review the NAFTA trade agreement. But most people thought that this was more of a campaign statement than anything else. And fundamentally, one had to interpret sort of Obama's more general view of foreign affairs, of U.S. foreign policy, than focusing on specifically what he was saying about Latin America. The one indication, perhaps, was that Felipe Calderon was the first president that he saw after the election. President Calderon traveled to the United States to meet with Obama before his inauguration, which seemed to signal at least some real attention to the region.
Right. And then we moved ahead to the summit in April.
Well, the summit was a great success for Obama. There was no question that he was going to be the center stage. He was going to be the highlight of the. He was going to be sort of the central actor in that he was the new guy on the block. People wanted to see him. They wanted a sense of what kind of leader he was going to be, and clearly he came across well. His temperament, his style, his responses to questions, his good humor throughout, and I think throughout Latin America, people walked away feeling better about the U.S. than they had before. Obama's election was what, in some ways, generated enormous goodwill in Latin America, and the Trinidad-Tobago summit meeting tended to confirm and amplify that.
Right. Now, after that, of course, things got more difficult for a number of reasons. You had more coverage of the financial crisis. You also had the issue in Honduras. And so one question I've been asking other folks in the office is, what for you was the big story of 2009 looking at Latin America and the Caribbean?
Well, I think there's two really big stories. One was the good news, which was the fact that Latin America seemed to resist the worst effects of the economic crisis, that what had been expected to be a very serious, deep reversal actually turned out more mild for Latin America. Some countries like Mexico suffered worse, but by and large the countries really managed the crisis very well and came out of it looking pretty good, presuming that things are going to continue to head in an upward direction. The other piece of news, of course, was the coup d'etat in Honduras, which was the first coup d'etat that really had all the appearances of the coup d'etats of the 60s, 70s era. And it sort of brought up the nasty memories of that era. There have been coups that were very similar to Honduras, but the notion of the military force going to the palace, waking the president up and taking him out in his pajamas was just what sort of reminded everyone that this was a real throwback. And there was no question that the response initially was probably too hard, too harsh, and it didn't leave open the possibility of negotiations. And the coup and the first reaction to it created a hardening, a toughening, everyone stiffening their resolve. And in fact, then we had 4 months of uncertainty, almost 5 months of uncertainty. and polarization to boot.
So what does Honduras, looking at 2010, what does Honduras mean for the region, and is this part of a larger issue regarding security and democracy, especially in Central America?
I'm not sure of that. I think that Honduras is a small, poor country with very vulnerable political institutions. What happens in Honduras is not necessarily going to happen anywhere else in the hemisphere. It's not something that is likely to pave the way for a change. Coups have really disappeared into history in most of Latin America, and I don't think this is going to change a whole lot. Question is whether the Honduran situation is going to be completely resolved or not. I think it's 50-50. It's a real question of whether, in fact, countries are going to recognize the new government or whether they're going to continue to hold out. But by and large, I think that inter-American relations will resume their normal path. I don't think that Brazil and the United States and other countries of the hemisphere are going to focus on Honduras any more than the Cuba anomaly or the Cuba exclusion dominated inter-American relations. I think things are going to settle down. Whether the crisis in Honduras is fully resolved or not.
Right. And touching on Brazil, obviously 2009 was a very big year for Brazil. Can you talk to me a little bit about that?
Well, I think that for a variety of reasons, beginning earlier than 2009, Brazil really emerged as a regional pole of power, an alternative to the United States. Its influence and stature worldwide grew enormously. A variety of reasons for that. I think the leadership of Lula and President Lula and his predecessor Cardoso was very important. I think Brazil's steady economic growth over the past 5 or 6 years has been contributed to that. So has the resistance, Brazil's ability to get through the economic crisis as well as it did. The efforts by the Lula government, the successful efforts to reduce poverty and bring down the massive inequality in the country, all began to lift Brazil up into the realm of a country that was important globally. And this was an aspiration of Brazil for many years. It saw itself as a country of immense size, large population, potential wealth, and suddenly Brazil is moving to fulfill that aspiration.
Right. And so now, here in the office and throughout Washington, you hear talk about this, about figuring out what Brazil wants in the way of a foreign policy. And so now you have sort of some might say two major foreign policy actors in the region of the U.S. and Brazil. Do you think they are going to continue to collide? Are they going to meet on a lot of points? Where do you see that relationship going?
Well, I think one has to recognize that for almost all of the Bush years, Brazil and the United States maintain a good, constructive relationship. There's a lot of goodwill between President Lula and President Bush. At the same time, on many, if not most important issues, the U.S. and Brazil were at odds. They disagreed with one another. I don't think that that's changed a whole lot. That I think that Lula and President Obama seemed to get along extremely well. They had an easy exchanges at the various meetings they were together. President Lula had a very satisfactory, a very constructive visit to Washington. Yet at the same time, the two countries disagree on a series of critical issues. And it may have come more center stage these disagreements than they had in the past. I think in part because more had been expected from the Obama administration. And I think that Brazil was feeling increasingly confident in its own role. I think the main challenge, a lot of, let me say that the discussions of Brazil always turn, are is Brazil and the U.S. going to be partners? Are they going to sort of develop a strategic relationship? My real sense is that the issue for Brazil and the United States is not developing strong cooperation on issue after issue. It's not developing a partnership. It's finding a way to interact, to relate to one another, to engage one another constructively, and tolerate each other's differences, and simply agree to disagree, and accept and accept and expect and tolerate these levels of disagreement, because at times Brazil does importantly serve U.S. interests, importantly help the U.S. advance its agenda. Certainly the U.S. can help Brazil advance its agenda. At times they'll cooperate, but I think they're going to continue to disagree on lots of issues, and that level of disagreement just has to be accepted and expected by both sides.
Right. As the recession started, I know you started the Economies Roundtable. Can you talk a little bit about what concerns economists had as there started to be signs of a pending recession, and what did some experts on Latin America fear might happen to the region? What were the historical precedents?
Well, I think we should start with the historical precedents. Was that when there was a recession in the United States, a global turndown, Latin America tended to suffer more than the average country. That the impact of the Asian crisis was particularly sharp on Latin America. Previously, Latin America had just been very vulnerable to these external shocks. And the fear was that here you had the U.S. going into its worst recession ever, its worst financial crisis. There's a financial crisis in a series of other countries that are crucial to Latin America. And the fear was that Latin America's economies would suffer a sharp downward pressure, and it would be enormous economic setbacks, which would lead in turn to some serious social setbacks. The advances on poverty and equality that had been registered would be turned back. And also that this, the economy is very important in the politics of the region, and that there might be some real serious political implications of a downward slide in Latin America. What actually came out of it was that the Latin America, the decline, the downturn seemed to be, for most countries, shorter and less severe than it was globally. Latin Americans seem to have been one of the last regions to enter into a sharp downturn, and one of the first to begin to emerge from it. And I think what's striking, some countries of course did perform very badly. Worst was Mexico. But on the whole, this was this response to the crisis, this mild impact on Latin America was really widely shared. This is what was so surprising. One would have expected large differences between some countries who seem to be managing so well, like Chile, and other countries that seem to be managing so badly, like Argentina or Venezuela. And instead, you had a real convergence in the impact of the crisis and the downturn across Latin America, which suggests that Latin America is following a more convergent set of economic policies than most analysts had foreseen, had really believed, and which may be a sign of good news, that there may be more opportunities for some form of economic integration in the future, this kind of convergence. There are outliers, clearly, but the region as a whole seems to be headed in the same economic policy direction.
Right, good. If we can focus a little bit on Mexico, obviously it was in the news a lot in '09 here in the States. Do you think that what we see going on in Mexico is an issue related to this current financial crisis, that it's a matter of just getting their economic ducks in a row, or do you think there's something else that going on there, obviously?
Well, that whenever you have the kind of economic downturn Mexico has, and it's going to lose some 6 points of GNP this year. From the high point to the low point, they've lost almost 10 percentage points of growth. Clearly, there's a lot of reasons for this. I think whatever the crisis brought, it was really compounded by some real structural problems in Mexico that successive governments just haven't been able to deal with effectively. Probably one of the key factors was the mismanagement of energy resources coming from the Mexico's constitution, which doesn't allow foreign investment in energy and petroleum, which means essentially that they're beginning to fall further and further behind, and we're seeing a slippage in production there. And what happens in the oil sector is terribly important because it has an immediate impact on Mexico's fiscal situation, that Mexico does not have a large tax burden. It raises most of its revenues, or at least half of its revenues, from oil sales. So a drop in oil sales also reduced the government capacity, and all this, of course, then compounded, multiplied by the effects of the crisis. What many people, many analysts were particularly disturbed about is how the close relationship with the United States tended to aggravate the crisis. It didn't serve as a safety net. It didn't serve to help Mexico resist the sort of the hurricane winds of the crisis. Instead, it tended to accentuate the problems for Mexico.
Right. Now, Augusto talks about how some might take that as an erroneous lesson from what we saw in the past year. They might take what they saw in Mexico and say, okay, we need to close our economies, that those that were most open, especially to the U.S., were the ones that were hit hardest. But you don't necessarily see that, because in the rest of the region, and I read that in your paper and in your last statement, they are moving more or less in the same direction, and it's not a direction of closing their economies. They're all moving together towards a sort of regional opening, right?
I think that, fundamentally, I think that the relationship with the United States and NAFTA has not served Mexico as well as it could have. I think that the problem is less in the NAFTA arrangement itself than in the fact that the Mexican, the politics of Mexico make it very difficult for that country to take some very crucial decisions about the future of its energy exploitation, about the future of its managing its own budget and fiscal areas. There's a series of very severe problems that Mexico faces that several governments in succession have not been able to deal with. And the fact is that this is not the fault of NAFTA. NAFTA does bring opportunities, but Mexico has to make some choices to be able to better take advantage of those opportunities. And I think the U.S. could be more helpful than it has been on this. In other words, that I don't have a formula for exactly how to go about this, but the sharp downturn during this economic crisis should be ample warning for Mexico that they really have to take some very hard decisions, if not in the next year or two, certainly shortly thereafter.
Right, right. And then looking at the region that did do relatively well, what were some of the policies that were implemented and adopted in the early 2000s, the years leading up to this recession, that really helped them to weather the storm?
Well, I think that there's a variety of reasons. One was a good deal of luck in the fact that their commodity exports began to fetch very high prices. The demand from Asia, demand worldwide was very high. So that had very little to do with, if you like, their economic reforms. I think the economic reforms that did have a very positive salutary effect on the countries where they managed to bring their debt to GDP ratios down very substantially. I mean, countries that were, massive debtors became relatively modest debtors. Brazil is a prime example of that. There was a great deal more fiscal discipline showed by virtually every country, which many countries were running primary surpluses, and in part their exports expanded very largely, very significantly, in part due to the greater demand, but also the fact that the countries were paying much more attention to exports and the importance of exports in their economy. And so these are a variety that virtually every country kept inflation down. Remarkably, the largest, highest level of inflation was Venezuela. That's not remarkable. What is remarkable, it was less than 30%, which at a time not too long ago, Brazil and some other countries were running inflations of 30% a month. Clearly, even the countries on the outliers regarding this converging economic policy I talked to really have adopted a certain orthodoxy and discipline that just wasn't very present in Latin America in the 80s and early 90s.
My last question about the financial crisis is, at the G20 in London, there's a lot of talk about the new global financial structure, about the BRICS, the rise of Brazil, this new governance at the World Bank and the IFIs. And can you, there's been a lot of coverage of Latin America doing very well in its recovery from this recession. Do you see a new, perhaps more esteemed place for Latin America in the global financial structure?
I think you're going to see a much more important role for developing countries in the new financial structure. The shift from the G8 being the central decision-making is a hard word, to the central area for discussing global economic problems is now shifted to the G20, which includes at least half of the countries are developing countries. Similarly, I think we're going to begin to see the World Bank shifting, the IMF, that you're going to see just a larger role for developing countries. Now, the fact that Latin America is a developing area means perhaps a somewhat larger role, but I think there's it's largely the third world, developing world, that's going to have the larger role, not particularly Latin America.
And Brazil?
Well, Brazil is one of the major countries. The projections are that Brazil will be the fourth largest economy in the world in maybe 20, 25 years from now. But two other developing countries, India and China, will be among the top four as well, and the fourth will be the United States, and Mexico may be fifth. So, yeah, I mean, there's every reason to think that Mexico and Brazil will become increasingly important, but that's because of their own size and their own depend on their own size and whether or not they have economic success.
Right. That's great. And so to wrap up here, looking ahead, what do you think will be the big story of 2010?
Oh, well, first you have a whole series of elections in 2010, and we're watching elections begin to take place. The cycle has started actually this year. Just in recent weeks, we've seen the Honduran, Uruguayan elections, the Bolivian election, and this week is the Chilean election. So we have, and then next year there's a whole slew of elections, and the outcomes of those and how they reshape inter-American relations, bilateral and multilateral, will be terribly important. The question of where the economies head now is the second big story. We're assuming that because the recession or the economic downturn is coming to an end, or apparently coming to an end in Latin America, doesn't tell us what the path of recovery is going to be, though. They could have a very rapid recovery, a so-called V-shaped recovery, a bouncing ball, or we could have a very slow L-shaped recovery that takes many years to regain the situation, regain the economic progress that was lost. So it's very hard to know, and the shape of that recovery, the pace of that recovery will be another crucial story next year.
Right. And another election, I believe, taking place next year is the OAS election.
Right.
And where has 2009 left the OAS as a body?
Well, I mean, there's two competing versions, two competing analyses and I'm not sure at this stage which is going to prove to be right. One is the OAS did not manage the Honduran crisis very well. It ended up polarizing the hemisphere. It did not provide a solution. The United States had to step in and negotiate, and it's still uncertain where the Honduran crisis is going to end. And the OAS has not proven to be a very effective institution. The other is, given the fact that the OAS is operating as a institution in a region that's sharply divided, and that it was rather surprising and helpful that the OAS could do as much as it did do. That it was as active in 2009 as it's ever been. It really worked very hard to find a solution to the Honduran crisis, probably harder than it's ever worked on previous crises. And the problem is that simply its members don't agree. There is a great deal of divergence. And so in some ways the OAS did a reasonably good job given the sharp differences among its members. And so I think history will interpret all this. But at this point, it's hard to know whether we have an OAS that's now more active, engaged, and dealing with the key issues, or we have an OAS whose real limitations have been revealed.
Great. And the last question I have is, you started in your paper to touch on the legacy question. I know we're still early on in the presidency of Barack Obama, but where at the end of the day do you think we'll see Obama's relationship with Latin America? Do you get the sense that he gets Latin America? Do you get the sense that he gets it, that he has the...
Well, I think he has a very good sense of Latin America. I think Secretary of State Hillary Clinton has a very good sense of Latin America, and it would be hard to do better than Arturo Valenzuela, somebody that knows the region. I think the problem is, in some sense, it's his legacy from before, that what he inherited in terms of the very sort of polarized U.S. politics on with regard to some key issues on Latin America. The very divisive politics of migration, trade, etc., that make very difficult to have a constructive Latin American policy. The politics of Latin America, with the countries divided among themselves, the oftentimes polarized within, make it very difficult. And third is the inheritance of this innate suspicion of the United States in Latin America. So it's not the problem of him and his administration getting or not getting Latin America. I think there are some real serious problems that may take 4 years of Obama, 8 years of Obama, and still will not be resolved. I think that what we should be looking for in the Obama administration is basically moving towards solving these structural problems and perhaps dealing with some of these long-term issues that have been on the U.S. agenda seemingly forever, whether it's Cuba, immigration, trade, that we don't seem to be able to address very well.